Hey, Cole, the Coleman Taylor Thomas, ready to start our podcast about how we watch movies and talk about our first impression, rewatch the movie, talk about our second impression, and then cover a topic at the end of it?
Oh, you know I am. Really long sentence, man.
Yeah, then let's do it.
Such a long intro. Oh, my goodness.
Gotta compensate for no musical introduction. Theme song. That's what it's called.
One day, when we make it the big times, we'll get there.
Then we'll get a theme song. Until then, it's just weird intros.
You saying a really long sentence.
Yeah, and really stumbling through it. But, this week we're doing a comedy, so let's embrace that.
Yeah, let's be goofy. Oh, gosh.
This week we rewatched The 40-Year-Old Virgin. So, just full disclaimer, this is a pretty raunchy rated R comedy. So, the stuff we're going to talk about is probably going to be, in relation to that. And just general disclaimer for our podcast, spoilers for everything all the time.
Always spoilers.
Sometimes spoilers for movies that aren't even the movie of the week. We've been spoiling stuff left and right all the time.
That's true. That's true.
So, there you have it. Episode 5. Finally telling you spoilers for everything.
Spoilers on spoilers on spoilers.
All the time. Okay, so this movie, The 40-Year-Old Virgin, came out in 2005, I think?
It was, 2005.
So we've been sitting on that first impression for a long time. What's your first impression of the movie?
So my first impression, I saw it kind of later than everyone else, but everyone would talk about how funny it was, and I agree. When I first saw it, I thought it was funny. It was kind of the same as all the comedies that were coming out around then. And Steve Carell was in it, and he was great. And that was when he was kind of first becoming big, so that was really cool to see him in a movie. He'd been in a few before. I think Anchorman came out before, and Bruce Almighty, where he was first noticed at all. And then that was the same year as The Office, I think. 2005?
Right. Yeah, 2005 was... Yeah, the first season of The Office started. He had been on The Daily Show, but yeah, he wasn't a big name at all. I don't think anybody knew his name. He was maybe recognizable, but nobody knew who Steve Carell was.
Yeah, exactly. So I always thought that was really cool. Because after he made that breakout role, going from Bruce Almighty, which looking back now, that scene's really cool to see that he was really the star of that kind of funny scene he had with Jim Carrey. And then seeing him in Anchorman, and I was like, man, I want him to be in more movies. And then comes The 40-Year-Old Virgin. So, but yeah, I remember it being really funny, and I loved Steve Carell. What about you?
Well, okay, so I remember thinking this week when we were watching this movie and I was coming up with stuff to say, I really don't feel like it's fair to call it my first impression, because it's really just my impression of the movie in general, because I've seen it a couple times over the years. Yeah. And I remember the very first time I saw it, I thought it was a little overrated, because I didn't see it right when it came out. And I remember being okay, I'm finally gonna watch this movie that everybody's been talking about for such a long time. And I was just kind of this is it. I didn't think it was that funny, I guess. And I thought it was really long. And I was just man, that's really overrated. But then over the years, the decade since the movie's come out, I've seen it plenty of times, and I've really found it funny in repeated viewings. And it sort of in my mind became this sort of modern comedy classic, in the sense that it just had this huge, great cast of big name comedy people before they were ever, in anything big. So it just seemed like this sort of landmark comedy. And then there's lots of moments in the movie that were quoted a ton in my high school. Did you find that in your high school?
Oh, yeah.
This movie was quoted to death.
Yeah, that's one of the things I wrote down. I wrote quotable, but I said with most comedies that came out during that day. I feel like if a comedy came out when you go to school the next day, after the weekend it came out or whatever, people are just going to be quoting it left and right. So yes, very quotable, but that's also just kind of an attribute of comedies in general.
It's crazy that. There's moments in the movie where I'm really just man, is this moment an iconic moment in comedy? Because it feels like that. It feels like these were really big moments, like the Kelly Clarkson thing and the Coldplay thing and Bag of Sand, all that stuff was huge right around when that movie came out. And I just remember it being sort of these big moments that people talked about.
Yeah, they got quoted all the time. But kind of what you were saying about it being funny. So I thought it was funny especially when I first saw it. I definitely agree that it wasn't as funny as other ones that were coming out. I think Anchorman was way funnier and other things like that.
Sure.
But I enjoyed the meaning behind it. I remember that. I remember thinking like this comedy kind of stands out over the others because it has more of a meaning than the others. You've got these group of guys around him trying to convince him that he's wrong, but in the way he lives, that he's weird, but is he weird? Are they weird? Do they have it all together? I remember thinking that, and that was really interesting for a comedy for me.
Yeah, and I agree. It wasn't like, I guess that did strike me the first time around. Like, it's not just a comedy for comedy's sake. There is more to it, and I don't really think I digested it too well. Like in my first viewing, my first impression of the overall film. Like, I remember thinking, oh, okay, there's something more here, but that's really it. I didn't really think about it too much then. And until this second viewing, I really was like, wow, there is like something deeper going on here. It really isn't just a comedy for comedy's sake.
Yeah, and I totally agree. The first time I watched it, I thought that at a very surface level, just kind of general, but still, since I was younger, I just focused on the like comedic, it's funny, and there's a little more meaning there, so that's cool. And then definitely the second time, though, I picked up like a lot more specific scenes and things they throw in just to give it meaning over just being another comedy.
Mm-hmm.
But I guess we'll get into that in the second impression.
Yeah, I mean, I guess, so like to sum up my first impression, I've always held the movie in high regard. Like, even though my very initial reaction to the movie wasn't very positive over the years, it's just as I've always looked back on it like, wow, that was an important movie, especially to the careers of all the people that are in it. And like, they're the biggest names in comedy right now. So yeah, I've always looked back on it on like this important sort of movie in comedy.
Yeah, I don't know. I never got that feel for it. But again, I'm a little biased because comedies aren't exactly my favorite. I obviously think they're funny, but I'm never like, oh, great. Unless it's really, really, really well done. Comedies just don't really stand out for me. I don't usually think of like staple comedies. Unless they're go to the other extreme and they're just really, really funny. Like, I know Anchorman, It's not the greatest movie, but it's obviously hilarious.
Right. So do you, in your initial reaction to the movie, did you think that it wasn't extremely well done?
I don't think so. I saw it back in high school, but no, I don't think it was really well done. I just thought it was kind of funny. Like, I've said that kind of 3 times already, but it was funny and then had a deeper meaning. But as far as like an overall movie, I wasn't like blown away by it or anything like that.
All right. So should we move on to our second?
I guess so.
Okay.
Jump right in.
Well, what was I had an immediate reaction. Like, as soon as the movie started, I was like, whoa, this is going to be different, because the last time I saw this movie was before I went to film school, before I started thinking about stories and movies critically. It was like, as soon as it started, I was like, whoa. I was pretty impressed by just like this, initially just the script. Did you have any immediate responses when the movie started?
Not when the movie started. I thought the script was good, but really overall the movie kind of felt disjointed to me. Like, I guess the pacing was really I guess because it's already a 2-hour-long comedy, and that's a little long for a comedy, but
right,
I don't know, the pacing just felt kind of off, and the script, like I said, was good, but it didn't blow me away really. What did you think was really good about the script?
Well, yeah, I still think that it's too long. Like, that's something I've always maintained. Every time I watch the movie, it's like, this is way too long. And that's just like, that's a general problem with comedies. It's like, for some reason, they're always way too long. I think you shoot, if you're a comedy, hit that 90-minute mark and then end on a laugh and get out of there. Like, they always overstay their welcome. But anyways, what impressed me in the opening was like, the script is like, it's like comedic clockwork. Everything happens when it's supposed to, and they hit the beats really quickly early on. I think eventually it does devolve, and we stretch things out too much. But they reveal that he's a virgin in the first 13 minutes, and then they introduce Trish at the 30-minute mark, and it's like just beat after beat. That's when they're supposed to happen in the script. It's like everything happens when it's supposed to. And that opening montage I really appreciate, because he's just like this normal guy. He's just like getting up and doing his thing, and they don't beat you over the head with the idea that he's like this ultra nerd. you see it in his apartment, and in that way it's kind of subtle, but you don't see him, like later on there's a montage where you see him do every nerdy thing he could possibly do.
Yeah.
but they don't open with that. Instead of opening with like that comedic beat of look how nerdy this guy is. We all know he's going to be the 40-year-old virgin. Look at him. Look at all the crazy, weird, nerdy stuff he does. Instead, we start in a subtle way. Like, he is this normal guy, and there are subtle hints of why he might be a virgin still. And then, but he's just normal, and he's going through his day. He goes to work, and then even like on his way to work, you see the eBay store in the background. It's like, I appreciated all that stuff. It felt like a well-oiled opening. And I was like, that's definitely something I would never have picked up on 10 years ago. It's like how good the script was, or at least how good this opening sequence was.
Yeah, I can definitely see that. One thing that stuck out to me, though, I guess it's just because I'm not in high school anymore, but I didn't think it was as funny, really.
Sure.
Still funny parts, and the classic parts are, of course, hilarious. I mean, just even if it's just the nostalgic value, just the scene where they're sitting playing Mortal Kombat, still funny.
Yeah.
But overall, I didn't find it as funny, and I guess it's just because back in high school, I thought I loved the vulgar humor. It's around Superbad came out, and those were like what was hilarious. And now it's kind of like vulgar isn't really. I don't really enjoy vulgar for vulgarity's sake, just to be funny. But at the same time, even though that's not exactly the comedy I like, this one still kind of stands apart from the others. Like, again, because of the meaning, and I could see it even more this time, how the vulgarity of the people around him just like juxtaposes his life. And I thought that was very interesting, because other movies came out were just like very vulgar just for vulgar's sake, but this one like had a purpose for it, and I liked that.
Yeah, I really appreciated that the second time around. I never picked up on the idea that like a lot of the humor, for me, the things that I found the most funny were like in that first poker scene, and he's just trying to repeat everything that everybody's saying, and he's trying to get in on it. That's where I find all the humor is like, clearly this guy is out of place in this world that is oversaturated with sex, and he's this inexperienced guy. That's where the humor is. It's not it's not vulgar for vulgar's sake. It's vulgar in relation to a guy who's not vulgar at all.
Right.
But at the same time, I agree that it definitely wasn't as funny this time around. Like, I don't think every joke aged very well. And like, particularly like that scene that I remember being so funny in high school was like, you know how I know you're gay? Blah, blah, blah. You know how I know you're gay? Blah, blah, blah. It's like, that was hilarious in high school. But now it's like, if this scene, exactly the way that it was, came out in a movie now, it would be viewed terribly. It's like, it's just not a scene that aged well at all. And the jokes are, the jokes in that scene altogether are not funny anymore. And it's kind of nuts that 10 years later, I mean, I guess it points to the idea that comedy can be very topical, and it's like of the time. Yeah,
that's very true. Like I said, I still think that scene's funny just because I remember laughing in high school about it.
Yeah,
definitely not as funny though.
To it.
Yeah,
yeah.
But one standout scene, and it was right in the opening to me, and I'm gonna try and keep it as least vulgar as I can, because I think that's the point of the scene. So it's Cal, who's Seth Rogen, and Andy talking about their weekend, and Cal just goes into how he just watched a very obscene scene between a woman and a horse. And right. So, but like back in high school when I saw that, people talked about things like that all the time. It was just the norm. People talked about seeing ridiculous things like that and watching videos with things like that. And then it switches over to Andy, who's like, yeah, I made a sandwich for 3 hours, and like goes into the details of making it. And then is like, oh, but I didn't eat it. And like Cal looks at him like he's weird. And I think he's weird. I'm like, that is so weird that you sat there and made a sandwich for 3 hours. And while I think what Cal did is weird too, it was so norm, like, of people talking about things like that, especially back in high school, obviously.
Yeah.
And then definitely. I'm like thinking, but Andy is just so weird for making the sandwich. And that really just stood out this time, how they, like, it just really was cool how they were going against the norms of society. I think that's really cool.
Yeah. I really appreciate that scene. Like early on, it's one of the ones that was like, man, this script is really good because that sort of nugget of a moment is like, I just really appreciate what it tells you about Steve's character. It tells you about like his life and what it's like at his place of work. Like if it's uncomfortable and it's awkward, and it was like I've had conversations like that at the places that I've worked with people that I don't know really well but have to spend a lot of time with. It spoke to that. It speaks to like how he is a little socially awkward, but at the same time, there's nothing wrong with him. You know, he did a normal thing. It was an uneventful weekend, and it was the only thing worth noting. You know, it's like there's nothing wrong about that, but it's just a little awkward, and it's like a great thing of like this is our main character Andy, and this is the world he lives in, yeah. And it's just like this great scene that doesn't beat you over the head with, you know, an easy exposition or character explanation. It's like this is just a nice slice of life, and in that scene you really get a sense of who he is and the kind of world he lives in. So it's like stuff like that in the first half of the movie was like much appreciated.
Right. Yeah, because I definitely enjoyed that, because all these people around him view him as weird. They're like, you're not normal, you haven't had sex yet, this is just strange. But all of their lives are just kind of messed up. And you see it through scenes like that throughout the whole movie. So, like I said, I just really enjoyed that they were kind of going against the norm of American society. Yeah.
Yeah. And, like, he says it at the end of the movie, and I don't really appreciate that he says it. It's like, it's real on the nose. But I guess it's sort of fine. But Andy says at the end, you know, I realized there was nothing wrong with me. I've been a virgin for 40 years, but I realized there's nothing wrong with me. I was just waiting for you. He says it to Trish at the end of the movie.
Yeah.
And it's like, yeah, ultimately that's the whole movie. It's like, there is nothing wrong with Andy. Like, in fact, these people that are having too much sex or are having sex for the wrong reasons or with the wrong people or just too much of it, they're the ones that have these crazy messed up lives. And Andy is just this normal guy who's trying to figure things out. And all of the comedy, all of the humor, all the awkwardness pivots on that idea. Like he's the center and he's the normal guy, and he lives in this crazy oversaturated world. And that's where the humor comes from. And I always like really appreciated that throughout the movie. Like he is a well-adjusted normal guy who's just a little socially awkward because the world is convincing him that there's something wrong with him.
Yeah, I agree. That's kind of just where I stand with the movie as a whole. Like everything we've talked about, not as funny as it was, but I really enjoyed that they tried to incorporate a deeper meaning into a comedic movie. I feel like the meaning stood more than the comedy, while usually in comedies it's the other way around. If they put in a meaning at all, it's going to be hidden under deep, deep layers of comedy. So I thought that was really bold. And while it still isn't like one of my favorite movies or blew me away or anything, I really appreciate it, I would say.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's a great movie because of all that stuff. Because it understands that you can be a funny movie while having an actual story, while having real characters that are grounded in reality. And I think a lot of comedies lose their way, and it's like so many comedies sort of will tell crazy jokes at the expense of their characters. They'll just belittle their characters for the sake of humor, and it's such a bummer when I really appreciated that this was a movie that always respected its characters. I don't know. It's great the way that it is, but I do kind of wish it was a little less vulgar because it's a movie that I would love to like share with people and like, hey, watch this movie. I want to be able to recommend it, but at the same time, it's like, but there's crazy, terrible stuff. And I wouldn't necessarily recommend this movie to everyone. You know what I mean?
That's the one thing that I like. Could they have made the point they were trying to make while reducing some of the vulgarity?
Yeah.
Would it have lost the value, or is it just as it is and you can only show it to who you can show it to? I don't know. I really don't know.
I don't know. It's kind of nuts. Okay, so what's your... I guess let's try to sum it up. So after having rewatched the movie, now if somebody were to ask you about The 40-Year-Old Virgin, what would you say?
I think it would really depend on who it was. I think if they're just looking for a funny movie, probably not. It's just not as funny as it once was.
Yeah.
And also the vulgarness in it, so depends on how much I think they can take. But if you can take vulgar movies and you're looking for a movie that's good, has a meaning, and funny, it kind of has all of it, it just doesn't hit as well. I would say still watch it. It's a good movie.
I would say, like, after having seen it again, it makes me even more comfortable with the idea that this movie is, like, significant in a comedy film history sort of way. Like, I still think it's great to sort of see Steve Carell and Paul Rudd and Seth Rogen and even, like, Jane Lynch and Jonah Hill, all these comedic actors before they were really big names. I still think it's really fun to see them in one of their first roles. And I think it's like a significant movie in that sense. And I think it's, it's funny enough. I never sat there thinking, it isn't funny enough. And I think it's got an interesting story with good characters. So I would still recommend it, but with with a disclaimer that it is a hard R.
It's definitely R.
Yeah. All right, well, that's all we have to say about the 40-Year-Old Virgin. We can move on to our topic, which is the idea of what makes something classic. What are the sort of qualifiers to make something a classic movie or a classic book or a TV show or anything like that? So, what do you think? What's something what makes something considered a classic?
See, this is something I was struggling with, this topic, because one thing is it a classic? Like, are classics different based on different people? Like, is my opinion of a classic different? Well, obviously my opinion of a classic is going to be different from yours, but does that matter? Is it just like majority rule? If the majority of people think this is a classic, this movie is a classic? Or is it based off what you or I think? Like, oh, I think that's a classic, but I don't think that one. So therefore, in my mind, it isn't a classic. Or is a classic?
It's interesting. I don't know. I would say more often than not, popular opinion is what sort of determines a classic movie. Because I feel like in a lot of ways, people just sort of by default say it's time that determines what's classic and what's not. In 20 years, what are most people still talking about? What's still relevant within popular culture? Yeah. And I don't know if that's necessarily like how we should be deciding what's classic or not.
I do think time plays a part in it, though, for sure, because I think a classic definitely has to stand the test of time. It can't just be relevant for its time. Even if it's still a good movie for its time, I don't think it's a classic if it can't last through the ages. For example, if there was a movie that was really good back in the 50s, that was super relevant at the time and did great, but then it doesn't have as much impact now, I wouldn't consider it a classic, even if it's still a great movie.
Okay, so here are a couple of examples. There are some classic films that are really only classic because they were like the first couple, It's like nothing about them is really that inherently like significant, except for the fact that they were just the first of their kind. There's that film, that very first film of workers leaving a building, or of a train moving across the screen, or a horse running in place. Like, these are all some of the first examples of film ever, and it's like really the only thing significant about it is that they were the first of their kind. And so I don't know. Some part of me still wants to call it a classic, but I don't know why, except for just the fact that it's time. And I asked Molly the other day, like, if I were to pick a randomly like forgotten movie from the 20s, and it was a silent film, it was black and white, and we watched it, and we had never heard of it, and people don't talk about it, would you consider it a classic? And a part of me wants to, because it's this old movie, it's shot on film, it's silent, it's really old, like, and I want to consider it that. But if it's not one that's relevant in any way, can we still, or should we still call it a classic, or consider it, or think of it as a classic? I don't know.
Yeah, that's why I think it has to stand the test of time. So if, when it first came out, it did something groundbreaking and was the first of its time, and it still continues, that still shines through and is relevant to something today, or we can point back to how that made way for things today, I think it could still be considered a classic. But if it just lived in its time and did something groundbreaking and then that's kind of it, I don't know. I don't think that would be a classic necessarily.
Like, do you think Avatar will eventually be considered a classic?
I think it could be. And that's why I really struggle with this whole idea is it majority rule or is it my rule? Because then if it's majority rule, then classics can be movies that I don't think are good, and I don't like that.
Yeah.
But
yeah, I know. But that movie had a huge impact on our culture that time. It was massive. But in the years since, I feel like people have sort of genuinely like turned on the movie because all this sort of big hullabaloo about the new technology and the box office records, I think all that stuff eventually fades. Like, who cares about it in the long run? Yeah. What's left is your product, your story. And if it's not that strong, I feel like, it's going to dwindle to sort of an appropriate reaction that we just couldn't find in 2009.
Yeah. That's probably
so.
True.
I pulled up information on the National Film Registry just as an example. The National Film Registry, they select movies every year. I think they select like 25 movies a year to be preserved in the Library of Congress. And so I thought it was interesting, like, how do they determine what's worth preserving and what's worth keeping? So on their website, it says the National Film Registry is a list of films deemed culturally, historically, or aesthetically significant that are earmarked for preservation by the Library of Congress. And one of the only qualifiers is that the movies inducted have to be at least 10 years old. And there are currently 675 films, some of which have never even been released to theaters. Like, that's not a qualifier. Length is not a qualifier. Whether or not it was released theatrically is not. So it's like just any important films that are at least 10 years old.
I don't think it should be just about time, but I think time should be important. So they had no other qualifiers?
No, other than just the idea that they have to be culturally, historically, or aesthetically significant, which I guess is hard to sort of define. Mm-hmm. And it would be something for like a committee to discuss.
Right. Because that's what I was wondering. What do they judge it on in that room? Because that at least leaves it a little broad. Mm-hmm. Because then if you make it too specific, there could be movies that wouldn't qualify even if they could have potentially been classics just because there are now specifications about it. I think it's good to be broad. And I do think time's important to a classic. Like you just mentioned, is Avatar going to be a classic years from now?
I don't know. The 40-Year-Old Virgin, by the way, is not in the National Film Registry.
Of course it isn't. It's not a classic.
Okay. But we kind of hit on the idea that it is a little culturally significant, maybe not more so than other films. But let's think. It's definitely not significantly or aesthetically significant. I mean, it looks like any other movie. There's nothing unique about that. Historically, maybe not, but I feel like it's still kind of interesting. I guess it's not their first roles, but it was like Steve Carell's first leading role. Yeah. And maybe that's not that historically significant, but I guess it is for me. I love Steve Carell, and for me it's like a big moment for him.
Steve Carell's wonderful.
Such the anchor of that movie.
I mean, I just think there's plenty of other movies that beat it out. Yes, it can be culturally relevant at the time, but you have to dig really deep for that. I'm sure there are other movies that just did it better, I suppose.
Sure. Okay, so I've got another set of examples. I've got a poster that's like 101 classic movie lines, and so I thought it was interesting, like, what makes these movies classic. So I wrote down a couple, and we can talk about whether or not we would consider them classics. One of them is Donnie Darko. Would you consider that a classic movie?
Ooh, that brings up another thing. Donnie Darko definitely has a cult following.
It does, yeah.
And a cult following that comes kind of later than when the movie came out. I think it could be. I think it has the potential to be a classic, but
okay.
That's just because it's so different and interesting. But
yeah.
But I don't know. I think other movies could beat it out in the realm of being a classic.
Sure. So the other ones are like Gladiator, Toy Story, Star Wars, Braveheart, Casablanca, The Sixth Sense. The Sixth Sense, I was like, is that a classic movie? I guess maybe it is. It sort of implanted itself into popular culture so much. It's been referenced like almost to death. It's like a movie that a lot of people talked about for a long time. And I don't know if that warrants it being classic. But also the line from the movie is insanely quotable.
Yeah.
So, I thought this list, that these 101 movies were pretty interesting. I mean, Braveheart, Casablanca, Gladiator, those are all like great movies.
Yeah, I think Sixth Sense is a classic just because most people you talk to are going to know it right off the head, not just right off the top of their head, not just because of not just because it's quotable, but just because it was so took you off guard, unless it didn't because you knew. But but it was an interesting concept, and then it was a well done movie with quotes that everyone quoted. It's a classic. I feel like as our society, majority people should know.
Are the Harry Potter books classic?
Oh, they could be. They're pretty relevant. I mean,
I know.
It really restored a lot of kids' interests in books. So it definitely could be, I would say.
Yeah. I mean, I want to consider them that way, and I think that they're going to live on for a long time. I think kids are going to be reading that book forever, or books, because they're great. But I thought it was interesting. I want to consider it a classic, but it hasn't even been 10 years since the last book. Mm-hmm. And then if you consider this new book as a part of that, then obviously it's been like a couple of weeks since the last book. But yeah, those books have had such an impact. You gotta, I guess, probably classics.
Yeah, probably. Again, like you said, I think it's got to wait a little while. But yeah, I think if you add in how well the story was written, even if you can find better writing out there, better literature, quote unquote, I still think overall the impact it had and the uniqueness of its story could definitely put it in the rankings of a classic.
Oh, so let me ask you about this. What about Bill Cosby? And all things Bill Cosby. 2 years ago, I would have said anything Bill Cosby touched, classic. The Cosby Show, classic. His stand-up specials, classic. Bill Cosby was a huge player in the world of comedy and influenced. All of the big names right now were influenced by Bill Cosby. Judd Apatow, director of 4-Year-Old Virgin, adored Bill Cosby. So it's interesting, anything we now consider a classic could sort of have something terrible happen to it, like Bill Cosby. And does that sort of nullify the work that came before it? Are we going to consider Bill Cosby classic in 10 years from now, considering all that's happened?
I still think we should. His art, we don't have to necessarily consider Bill Cosby a classic, but what he made could still be considered art, even if there's things surrounding it that aren't necessarily the best. But I don't know. That's interesting. Because every time you watch it, though, that's true. But I still don't think that should nullify that it was
classic status.
I mean, he's not the only one that put work into that. There were tons of people in that. So just because something has come up, I don't think it should completely nullify it being a classic.
But I do think it speaks to the idea that time is a very important factor in all of this, because you never know what's going to happen or how the world's going to respond to something in retrospect, given things that may or may not have happened. So, yeah, I mean, I guess time is a pretty big factor.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Interesting indeed. We've solved the riddle.
Yeah.
What is a classic? Or not at all, but oh well.
Did that thing with my hands as if I was done, and we've solved it.
The more you know.
What's the equation? Film plus time equals classic.
Yeah. Film plus... Right. Every film that's over 10 years old is a classic.
Oh, that's awesome. Any film released to VHS, classic.
Classic, absolutely.
Any film that made it to VHS.
I've got a stack of VHSs over in the corner. All classics. Black Beauty, classic. Recess Christmas, classic.
Black Beauty. Gosh, okay. That's great. Well, seems as though we're back to our initial runtime for these episodes. We went kind of long for a couple of weeks.
Yeah.
We apologize for that. Unless you love it, then you're welcome.
Just let us know in like a review or maybe tweet at us.
Yeah. Tweet at us. Let us know what are your qualifiers for something that's classic. What did you think of The 40-Year-Old Virgin? Do you still like Bill Cosby? Tweet us whatever you want. And write us a little review if you liked it. If you didn't, I guess you could still do it. I don't know. Do whatever you want. We are on Twitter. I'm at Joshua Kazemi. Coleman is
at Cole Tailored.
You gotta start tweeting though.
It'll never happen.
Give Coleman a reason to start tweeting. Tweet at him. Ask him a question, and then he's like, I gotta
now
tweet
I
a
have
response.
to tweet. Great.
Now I gotta start.
Oh.
You have the power in your hands, listener, to force Coleman to start tweeting. I would jump on that if I were you. All right, I think that's it for this week.
I think so too.
We will see y'all next week. Thanks for listening. Good night.
Bye.